The Virginia Cable Telecommunications Association and your local cable provider presents Cable Reports. Join us now as Cable Reports brings you up to date on current issues facing the Commonwealth through discussions with your local legislators and other policymakers from across Virginia.
Welcome from the General Assembly in the City of Richmond. I'm Woody Evans for Cable Reports and Cox Communications. Well, the dreaded day is here. This is crossover day. To some, congratulations. To others, condolences, depending upon which house you may be in. Because today, all Senate bills need to be to the House, and all House bills need to be to the Senate. Some say this is when the Senate really starts working hard. But in any event, we have two guests here today to discuss a lot of issues that are still pending before the General Assembly. Senator Tommy Norment, welcome, sir.
Good morning. It's good to be here with my good friend Harvey, and I just would, your opening comment, have to say, you do realize it takes 2.5 delegates to do the work on Senator.
Delegate Morgan, I want to hear your comment on that.
Going there. but I think it's interesting to know that this will be the first time since we've been here early in January that we will get to see each other on a regular basis. During the first half, the Senate does its thing, the House does its thing, and we hardly ever see each other. Now, the senators will be presenting their bills to the House, and we'll have to deal with them, and vice versa. So we get to see a lot of each other.
Well, talking about seeing each other, I know you're still hearing from constituents, and you see them as they come to visit. What are you hearing from your constituents?
Everybody wants money.
Everybody wants money.
Everyone wants money, and unfortunately, there's so little. This has been a very, very long recession, as you know. But I'm pleased to report, I believe since June, every month has been better, and so Virginia's economy is rebounding, albeit slowly, consistently. Employment is up. The two principal forms of revenue, personal income tax and corporate income tax, are up, and so we've turned the course. And the recent report just Sunday we presented the budget, and we were able to report an additional $150 million that we didn't count on that we could work with. So things are looking up, even though it's still very difficult. And with the stimulus money ending June the 30th, next year is probably going to be even tougher than this year has been. Even though we have turned it, it's still not. We're not out of the woods yet.
Great. And Senator Norman, I'm sure jobs and the economy are at the top of your list in terms of what you're hearing from your constituents as well.
That's been a consistent echo that I've heard from the citizens of the 3rd Senatorial District for many, many months. Of course, the historic triangle, which I represent, is highly dependent upon tourism. A lot of seasonal jobs there, but also there have been a number of reduction in workforces there during this recessionary time. Down in Newport News, only part of which I represent, we have the Newport News shipyard, currently under Northrop Grumman. Of course, they're talking about spinning that off, and that's creating some uneasiness as to actually how that restructuring will look. Harvey mentioned about the turn in the economy. It is gradually turning, and I think all of us that work on the budget are encouraged, but we need to realize while revenues have picked up for the last few months, we're comparing that increase over 2010, which was pretty dismal. The other message that I am consistently hearing from the citizens at home is to exercise some fiscal restraint and some fiscal discipline, and don't spend every dollar that we get on new initiatives. Don't spend new money and embedding it in a budget item that is going to reoccur on an annual basis. If you're going to spend the money, try to target one-time expenses, or perhaps try to target areas that we cut fairly dramatically in 2010. So the messages I'm hearing are very similar to what Harvey's hearing.
Well, as Senate Minority Leader, you have additional responsibilities, do you not?
Well, there's some who would like to think so. I continue to characterize myself as just a old country boy in the soybean fields from James City County, but even Harvey's not buying that anymore.
What do you mean anymore?
What I try to do is develop a consensus and maintain some civility within our Senate Republican caucus. We've had a history over a number of years of having some internal disagreements that have frequently poured over into the public arena. So I've tried to build a consensus, be patient, encourage people to be tolerant of one another's position, even though they may disagree. And that sounds so civil and so easy, but believe me, particularly when you get in the stressful times of the General Assembly session and people get invested in their own legislation, it's not quite as easy as it seems. And that's why we use the trite expression of herding cats.
Herding cats.
But there's a lot of meowing and scratching, I can tell you.
Is it the same for you as chair of the Agricultural Committee?
Well, I was thinking in the House, we don't have that. The House is not at all like that. I'm kidding, of course. Actually, I used to chair the Commerce and Labor Committee, which I did maybe a decade or so, and I've thoroughly enjoyed that. That's all the big corporations. You have banks, and you have insurance companies, and all the workers' comp issues, the utilities, all of those things come before that committee, and I thoroughly enjoyed that. But since I've been chairman of the Agriculture, Chesapeake, and Natural Resources Committee, I've realized a stark difference. In the former committee, everyone who came was dressed to the nines, with the nice suits. They were all dispassionate. They were representing someone else, so there was less emotion involved. But with the Agriculture Committee, people are representing themselves or their dogs and cats. It's or their cattle. It's much more visceral, and I thoroughly enjoy it. And of course, because it involves the Chesapeake and Natural Resources issues very close to my heart, and I have a big farming area in my district. It really suits me better, and I've enjoyed it very much.
So you had a pretty long day yesterday, and I'm sure you anticipate the same today in terms of crossover. Where is the governor's transportation package now?
Woody, actually yesterday the Senate reported the governor's transportation package. We accelerated that bill on the docket. It's not uncommon for the major pieces of legislation or the controversial pieces of legislation to come in at the 11th hour of crossover or even at the end of the session. In order to try to lighten our workload today, we accelerated the transportation bill. As I recall, it was reported out of the Senate 34-6. So the governor's transportation package enjoyed a very substantial and convincing vote coming out of the Senate. I commented to Harvey just before we went on camera that actually I think we spent more time debating that transportation bill than any other bill that we took up yesterday. And it wasn't a particularly vicious or attacking discussion. It was more that a number of the senators who were dissenting against the bill wanted to articulate why they were not supporting it. So it moved very, very strongly through. I think that while there may be some differences with the bill that ultimately comes out of the House, that eventually in conference it will be reconciled. Mm-hmm. And this will be another effort to do something on transportation. Harvey remembers that the last meaningful thing that we did in transportation was in 1986 under Governor Belial's. There were quite a few pints of blood that were left on the floor of the House and Senate in 2007 over the infamous House Bill 3202, which had a lot of warts, but some residual benefits, including these bonds that are included in the governor's current plan that we're accelerating. We've tried desperately, and I mean Republicans, Democrats, members of the House, members of the Senate, to do something meaningful on transportation for many, many years, and we have been completely unsuccessful. So I'm hoping at least this will move the ball down the field a little bit, and we can get some projects going and at least get a commitment to move transportation.
And Delegate Morgan, apparently it's a good time to borrow money. Interest rates are down. The Commonwealth has a AAA bond rating, and costs are down in terms of construction work in Virginia. So I take it that this is a good package.
It is a good package, and it passed with a good majority in the House. Right now, as you say, is the very best time to invest in highways, or not just highways, but all transportation, whether it be rail or mass transit, because interest rates are low. The contractors need the work, so we'll be putting a lot of people to work, and we will be able to get them at the best prices with the interest rates very favorable. My biggest concern, I've expressed this to the administration. Tommy mentioned 1986. At that time, we raised 4 taxes. We increased the sales tax 0.5%, 2 cents on the gas tax, a tire tax, and a titling tax to put more money into the transportation coffers. Well, we put so much money in so fast that contractors didn't really have to bid against each other as much. And so it was sort of, you take this one, I'll take that one. And so I think we were not as prudent in our investments. And so I'm very hopeful that this time we will be much more careful. I've urged that over and over, and I hope they've heard the message.
Great. Speaking of prudent investments, there is a need to some extent to shore up the Virginia retirement system. And some of the governor's proposals are still on the table, as I understand it. Current employees will receive a raise, or at least that was the original plan, but then they would be required to contribute to that pension fund. Where does that all stand?
Well, the Senate has not embraced that concept with great affection, and in fact, Senators Watkins and Senator Stosh had offered some alternative approaches towards the VRS. What the governor had proposed in reaction to what did not take place as a result of the 2010 legislation was that every state employee would have to contribute 5% towards their retirement. While this may seem heresy in the public sector in Virginia, it is not uncommon in the private sector. Matter of fact, it is unheard of that individuals in the private sector do not contribute to their retirement. But of course, there are salary differentials between the private sector and the public sector. The governor was trying to soften that some by offering state employees a 3% salary increase, which in essence, when you take the 3% salary increase from the 5% contribution to VRS, they would still be down 2%, and that's even before you take in consideration increase in health care cost, which most state employees are experiencing. So that was a concern, was that the state employees would end up with a net reduction in their take-home pay of 2%. The other concern was that many of the employees who are in VRS would not receive the 3% salary increase, such as the sheriffs. Many of the college and university faculty and classified members are in an alternative retirement plan, so they do not automatically get the salary increase. So there was the opportunity, if you will, for many employees who are in VRS to end up paying 5% more without any of the 3% salary backfill on it. Also, when the Senate reported out its budget on Sunday evening, that we did not take any of the $150 million in unanticipated revenues that we have and backfill that into VRS. So I think that's clearly going to be a subject that is going to go into conference with our good friends in the House of Delegates, both on individual legislation and also in the budget.
So going from a defined benefit plan to a defined contribution plan is something that will eventually occur?
Ultimately, I believe it will. We're not going to force people into that. The House budget, as Thomas says, is so different from the Senate budget. And it reminds me, years ago, when there were only 7 Republicans, I believe, in the House.
How long ago was that?
That was back in the 70s. When I was elected.
Before I was born.
When I was elected, there were 17, and that my year we jumped to 24. But there's a man named Caldwell Butler. That's the story I've heard about him. He is a wonderful man. He lives in Roanoke, and he was a freshman in the Virginia House of Delegates as a Republican, with 7 of them out of 100. And he went on to become an outstanding congressman. He's retired now. But Caldwell Butler went back home to speak to his civic clubs about his session in Richmond. And he said to them, you know, I went down to Richmond determined to create a 2-party system. But what I found out once we got there, we already have a 2-party system. It's called the House and the Senate. And that is absolutely true, Woody. The House budget and the Senate budget do not resemble each other. The conferees are going to have one dickens of a time to try to work out and resolve the conflicts, because we took entirely differing approaches. And that's not all bad. I mean, because we are different. We come from different thought patterns, and it's going to be a fascinating procedure to work out this budget. But we've got how many, 3 weeks to do it?
We do.
Yeah.
18 days, I believe.
Torturous.
Yes. Well, speaking of differences between the House and the Senate, you did agree to move the primary date from June 4th to August 23rd, but I assume there will be major differences in terms of what occurs in the special session on redistricting.
I expect that there'll be some modest disagreements. My good friends and fellow Republicans over in the House of Delegates, of course, have a working majority over there. Consequently, the redistricting plans that they present will probably be slightly more favorable. Even though you have a working majority, there are certain constitutional principles that you must adhere to, and if you do not address those constitutional principles, such as community of interest, contiguousness, recognizing majority-minority districts, then the Department of Justice is going to give you a little kiss on the cheek. Virginia is still under the 1964-65 Voting Acts, and we have to get pre-clearance on our redistricting. Over in the Senate, where there is a modest majority on the Democrats, I am confident that they will present a plan that will be slightly more favorable to their Democratic majority. I will say, before November a year ago, perhaps I had a little more anxiety about redistricting. I am very confident that our good friends in the House of Delegates on the Republican side are going to see that the Senate Republicans are not substantially disadvantaged. But more importantly, Governor McDonnell has made it very clear to everyone that he is not going to allow a redistricting program or plan that is presented that substantially disadvantages anyone. And the code word for that is that he's not going to accept a redistricting plan from the Senate Democrats that emasculates the Senate Republicans. He has stated unequivocally that he will veto plan after plan after plan until there is some parity. And I think to reinforce the governor being serious about some reasonable redistricting plan, it's important to remember that he has appointed that Citizens Commission that is looking at redistricting. Also, 5 of our colleges and universities are having sort of a competitive process, if you will, and they're submitting redistricting plans. So it's going to be an interesting process, and I expect there'll be a lot of rhetoric, but at the end of the day, we'll come out of it all right.
And Delegate Morgan, you've been through some interesting times since you've been here in terms of redistricting.
I'll tell you a couple of them. In 1981, the court determined that it was not good enough, but it was better than it had been. So we could run for 1 year and then come back and fix it, and then run again for another year, and then run again for a regular 2-year term. So we ran 3 years in a row, and that was tough. The only advantage was if you survived, you gained seniority in a hurry. But in 1991, the Republicans were getting close to a majority. The Democrats didn't like that, and so they put 15 Republicans and an independent into 8 districts and made us fight it out. As it turned out, the Republicans we held our own in the House, and we picked up a few Senate seats. So it worked out. But it's been as my predecessor, John Warren Cook, who was one of the most revered men. He represented us for 38 years and was the speaker for the last 12. In my first redistricting, he said to me, "I don't envy you, Harvey." He said, "Redistricting brings out the worst in everyone." And he's right.
Well, we know the population has increased to about 8 million. We know there has been a population shift, so apparently rural Virginia will lose some seats, whereas Northern Virginia will gain.
You know, my first decade we had just tipped a little bit. It had always been pretty much rural versus urban. I mean, rural dominated. And then my first 10 years, there was pretty much parity. And then with the 91 redistricting, it was tipped more to the urban. This time it's going to be tipped even more. So rural is much certainly in the minority now.
To what come back to a couple of points on that, Woody, while we're talking about redistricting. Harvey mentioned the 1991 redistricting. It's very interesting because the Democrats were in control at that time, and they drew districts that they thought would preserve their majorities for 10 years. They lost seats in every election cycle for the next 5 election cycles. And so when everybody gets hyper about the redistricting things, I'm not so sure it is a matter, once you get out of your minority districts, I'm not sure it's so much an issue about how you draw the lines. I think it's more important about the candidates that you have on the ground and whether or not they reflect the personality of the communities that they represent. The second thing is that there has been a migration, but I think it's important for our viewers to understand Newport News, Hampton, Norfolk, Portsmouth, Virginia Beach have all had shifts in the population, and they have lost. And what is going to happen, there's been a growth, but the growth has not been as substantial as, say, Suffolk, which was the fastest growing locality in Virginia. And what has happened, and I only can speak from the Senate side, is that those senators who represent those jurisdictions of Virginia Beach, Norfolk, Portsmouth, Newport News, and Hampton, they are all short on population. So they're going to have to pick up substantial numbers. I think where you're going to see a loss of a seat, at least on the Senate side, is out in the valley, maybe around Salem and Roanoke. But there are also discussions, at least I understand, about looking at Hampton Roads because of the loss of those populations. So it's going to be a very interesting and potentially dicey situation, but there's continued to be a migration from those metropolitan areas.
And I believe the math suggests that a senatorial district would be about 200,000 constituents and a House about 80,000.
I think those round numbers are pretty accurate, yes, sir.
Yeah. Back to transportation. What are some of the critical transportation needs in the area you represent?
Well, bridges. The York River Bridge is on everyone's mind, the Coleman Bridge, because there's still a toll on the bridge. It's the only bridge in the state system that has a toll, and it's used about 95+% of the use on that bridge is commuters traveling from the Middle Peninsula, Gloucester, Matthews, Middlesex, and King and Queen, across the river to work in the Lower Peninsula. And so it's patently unfair for them to have to pay every time they go across that bridge. And every year I get requests to try to do something about the toll, but the problem is that the bonds that were sold are based on toll revenue, and so it has to be paid back with tolls, and that's a real problem. There are several other bridges that need work. The highways are in pretty good shape, but it's a more rural area. We don't have the same kind of traffic congestion that we have on I-95 and 64 and 81.
And Senator Norment, I know you have part of Hampton Roads, and of course there's a lot of congestion there.
Well, I forgot exactly where we ranked, but I do know that Hampton Roads was in the top 10 of the most severely congested metropolitan areas in the entire country. So that's certainly not an accolade that we want. But following up on what Harvey said about the Coleman Bridge, I mean, Harvey and I have left a lot of perspiration over the years in the General Assembly. I mean, almost every year we'd put in some creative bill to try to give some relief to the Gloucester and the Middle Peninsula citizens. A lot of people coming over to Hampton and Newport News to work, including the shipyard. And as he mentioned, the bonds have been a significant problem, but it's a terrible inequity. The other thing, at least on my side of the water, that is very critical is the congestion that is starting to take place on Interstate 64 between Newport News and Richmond. It has gotten noticeably worse. I was very disappointed that there was not some money in the governor's transportation package to address that. The last time I looked at it, Williamsburg and James City County, where I live, I think we were getting 1 mile of bike trail out of that transportation package. But the important thing is you have to look sometimes beyond the local parochial issue for the betterment of the Commonwealth. And this is one of those times, but I expect Harvey and I are going to continue to press some of those issues for the people we represent.
Speaking of driving, I believe that you were successful yesterday in negotiating a bill that would, as a secondary offense, fine those who use cell phones while driving.
I was, and I recognize that it's going to be a struggle in the House of Delegates. Somehow they get confused that I'm infringing on some constitutional protection of privacy that they have. But I've been involved in this issue for over a decade. It's what we call distracted driving. About 10 years ago, DMV did a study, and it determined that the use of cell phones about a decade ago was the number 5 cause of accidents. Now it's almost number 1. You drive down Broad Street in Richmond, 64, 33, or 17 in Gloucester, and I guarantee you 8 out of 10 people you go by have got that cell phone stuck in their ear. It's almost like another permanent or fixed appendage, and it is getting to be a severe issue. In Virginia, this would be a fairly aggressive initiative, but I predict this. Eventually, the federal government is going to require the states to go to hand-free devices and tie it in to highway transportation dollars, just like they did with seat belts, just like they've done it with open container, just like they've done it with an 08 on DUI laws. They're going to force us to do it, and we might as well get out front and start getting our citizens to adapt to it.
Less than a minute left.
And a footnote on transportation. Secondary roads in the rural areas desperately need attention, and I think that's something that I want my constituents to know I'm concerned about.
Great. Great.
Well, in wrapping up,
Yes.
I would just like to encourage people to communicate with us about their interest. And we do get a lot of calls and emails, and it helps so much to hear from people. I appreciate it.
Great. Senator.
Well, like Harvey, I certainly appreciate it with emails, faxes, toll-free lines. There is no shortage of communication opportunities. And it's important, and I know Harvey shares in this, we're not always looking to hear from people who agree with us. We are anxious to hear people who have a different perspective and may disagree with us. I mean, we're part-time citizen legislators, and we're not necessarily armed with all of the most detailed and latest information. And it's amazing when you read the emails or correspondence from those who disagree with you, you actually can learn some very interesting perspectives on legislation we're dealing with. So like Harvey, I look forward to hearing from my citizens.
Great. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Woody.
Our guests today have been Senator Tommy Norment and Delegate Harvey Morgan. Thank you for watching Cable Reports. Until next time, I'm Woody Evans for Cable Reports and Cox Communications. Thanks, guys.